When I turned 65, we had a small gathering in the backyard of our home here in Franklin. I remember standing near the oak tree, holding a glass of iced tea, feeling perfectly capable, entirely myself, and convinced that the stories of sudden physical decline were mostly exaggerated. I felt like a man in his late 40s who just happened to have gray hair. But by the time I turned 68, just 3 short years later, I felt like I was wearing a suit made of wet lead. The descent was not a slow, gentle slope. It was a steep, terrifying drop. Injuries that used to heal in a weekend suddenly lingered for a month. A simple respiratory bug that used to inconvenience me for 2 days ended up keeping me in bed for 10, and left me with a cough that echoed in my chest for weeks. I noticed my shoulders narrowing. I felt a deep, pervasive exhaustion settling into my bones by 2 in the afternoon, no matter how many hours I spent in bed the night before. I felt, quite simply, like my body was running out of parts. I remember sitting in my leather chair in my study one evening, looking out the window as the sun went down, and feeling a quiet panic. My son Daniel, who is an engineer, often talks about material fatigue in his line of work. He explains how steel or concrete can hold up perfectly for decades, and then, within a very short, critical window of time, the microscopic fractures link together and the entire structure gives way. I honestly believe that was exactly what was happening inside my own skin. I thought I had entered the final window. I assumed the biological raw material of my youth, the cells responsible for keeping me upright and healing my wounds, had simply died off, and I was left trying to run a complex machine with a completely empty inventory. I assumed this was the inevitable contract of aging, and I was just paying the bill. It was during that 3-year period, as I watched my own physical capacity evaporate, that I started reading. I have spent my whole life in publishing, taking complex medical and educational texts and translating them for ordinary people. When I don't understand something, my instinct is not to guess. My instinct is to find the primary source, sit down with a pencil, and read until the confusion breaks. What I found during those quiet mornings, poring over research papers from places like Stanford and Mount Sinai, did not just surprise me. It completely shattered the narrative I had accepted about my own decline. I discovered that I had fundamentally misunderstood what was happening inside me, and more importantly, I realized I had a very narrow window of time to reverse it before the damage became permanent. The first thing I read that truly stopped me in my tracks was a paper explaining the actual inventory of our cellular repair crew. I had always believed that aging meant my stem cells were dying and disappearing, but the research showed something entirely different, something I found profoundly disturbing but also incredibly hopeful. It turns out even in my late 60s, I still had almost the exact same number of stem cells I had when I was 25. The biological workers were not dead. They had not left the building. The problem was that they had completely stopped working. I tried to visualize what this meant, and I kept coming back to the image of a massive renovation factory. Your stem cells are the young, capable workers. They are trained, they are ready, and they are waiting to be deployed to fix a torn muscle fiber, to repair a stiffened blood vessel, to rebuild the lining of your gut. But I learned that as we cross that threshold into our middle 60s, the factory floor becomes crowded with retired workers who refuse to leave. These are cells that have taken too much damage over the decades. They should have quietly passed away, a process the papers called programmed cell death. But they didn't. They got stuck. The researchers called these stuck, stubborn units senescent cells. And what I read next is what made me realize why I felt so terrible. These stuck cells don't just sit there quietly. They spend all day screaming. They secrete a constant toxic cocktail of inflammatory signals. I read the technical names for these signals, things like interleukins and matrix metalloproteinases, but the specific names mattered less to me than what they were actually doing. They were creating a deafening noise on the factory floor. They were poisoning the local environment. I realized that my young, capable stem cells were perfectly fine, but they were trapped in a toxic neighborhood. You can have the best repair crew in the world, but if you drop them into a completely toxic environment where they can't hear the orders and can't breathe the air, they will simply hunker down and do nothing. That is exactly what my body was doing. I kept digging, trying to understand how deep this dysfunction went. I found another set of papers that looked at the stem cells hiding in the bone marrow, the ones responsible for producing every single drop of my blood and the entirety of my immune system. The researchers had looked inside these specific cells in older adults and found another disaster. Every cell has its own internal recycling plant, a place where it breaks down damaged proteins and cellular garbage so it can be reused. In my body, that recycling plant was overwhelmed. The garbage was piling up inside the cell itself. The stem cell wasn't just living in a toxic neighborhood, it was drowning in its own internal waste. This explained everything I was feeling. It explained why my muscles weren't recovering. I read about a specific protein, a sort of cellular alarm clock that wakes the muscle stem cells up when you strain your back in the yard. In my 20s, that alarm clock was loud and sensitive. In my late 60s, the alarm clock was broken. My muscle stem cells had fallen into a sleep so deep that even a severe injury couldn't wake them up fast enough. This is why a pulled muscle was taking me a month to heal. The repair crew was in a coma. And it explained why I was catching every single cold that passed through Tennessee. I learned that because of this toxic environment, my immune stem cells were becoming confused. They were acting like an army commander on a chronic, panicked high alert. Instead of producing the highly trained special forces needed to fight off complex viruses, my stem cells were just blindly mass-producing low-level infantry. They were flooding my body with cells that only knew how to create blunt inflammation. I was losing my adaptive immunity and gaining a chronic systemic fire that was quietly burning through my joints and my brain. The researchers called it inflammaging. I just called it feeling old. If you are sitting there listening to me right now and you recognize these feelings in your own body and you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please take a moment to do that. I share these things because I know how isolating it is to feel your body slipping away and to be told it is just a normal part of life. Subscribing helps me keep finding this information and sharing it with people who actually need it. When I understood these mechanisms, the toxic neighborhood, the internal garbage, the deep sleep, the immune confusion, I realized something critical. The researchers were not saying this was a permanent, irreversible destiny. They were saying it was an environmental problem. And an environment can be changed. But I also understood that I was in a closing window. The longer those senescent cells sat there poisoning my tissues, the longer my muscle cells stayed in that deep coma, the closer I got to a point of structural failure that I would not be able to walk back from. I felt an immense, quiet urgency to clean up the factory floor. I knew I couldn't just buy a pill to fix this. The internet is full of people trying to sell you exotic stem cell supplements and miracle cures. From what I read, most of it is absolute nonsense. The interventions that actually showed measurable effects on this complex biology in the literature were quiet, daily, and almost entirely free. They required discipline, not money. The first thing I had to change was how I moved. I have never been a marathon runner. I have never enjoyed the gym. But I read that the most reliable, documented way to wake up those deeply sleeping muscle stem cells and to clear out the inflammatory noise in the blood was consistent aerobic exercise. I didn't need to break records. I just needed to move fast enough, for long enough, to send a survival signal to my biology. I started walking every single morning, not a slow stroll, but a walk with purpose, enough to make me sweat, enough to make holding a conversation slightly difficult. I did this for 40 minutes, 5 days a week, and twice a week I went down to the basement and lifted weights. Not heavy weights, but enough resistance to force my muscle fibers to ask for help. I learned that when you contract a muscle against resistance, you are physically ringing the alarm clock. You are forcing the stem cells to wake up and rebuild the tissue. Without that physical demand, they will simply sleep until they die. The second major shift was not just what I ate, but how I timed it. I read a fascinating trial about caloric restriction and how it affects the toxic load of those stuck senescent cells. I knew I couldn't starve myself, and I have no interest in being miserable. But I learned that I could mimic the biological signal of fasting just by compressing my eating window. I realized that my body needed time when it wasn't processing food, so it could turn its attention to cellular housekeeping. I stopped eating dinner late. I instituted a hard stop at 7 in the evening, and I didn't eat again until 10 the next morning. I gave my digestive system and my stem cell factories 15 hours of pure, uninterrupted quiet every single night to clear out the garbage. Within that eating window, I became extremely deliberate about what I consumed. I stopped thinking about calories and started thinking about anti-inflammatory chemistry. I read that extra virgin olive oil has specific compounds that directly inhibit the main inflammatory signaling pathway that poisons the stem cells. I started using it generously. I made sure I was eating fatty fish like salmon twice a week because the specific omega-3 fatty acids act like a chemical fire extinguisher on those toxic cytokines. I started eating broccoli and Brussels sprouts constantly because I learned they contain a compound that actually triggers the internal recycling plant of the cell to turn on and clear out the waste. And I made sure I was eating enough protein, spread out across my meals, because an older body requires significantly more raw material to rebuild muscle than a younger body does. I also had to confront my sleep habits. For years, I prided myself on getting by on 5 or 6 hours of sleep. I would stay up late reading in my study. But I found out that the circadian clock, the internal 24-hour rhythm of the body, directly controls the activation and rest cycles of the stem cells. By staying up late and staring at lights, I was confusing the master clock. I was telling my stem cells to work when they should be resting, and to rest when they should be working. I became absolutely rigid about my sleep. 7 to 8 hours in a dark, cool room, going to bed at the exact same time every night. And just as importantly, I started going outside for 15 minutes every morning right after I woke up, just to let the natural sunlight hit my eyes. That morning light is the signal that resets the clock and keeps the stem cells on their natural rhythm. There was one more mechanism I had to address, and it was the hardest one for me to accept because it felt too abstract. I read that chronic psychological stress and social isolation are biologically identical to smoking a pack of cigarettes a day when it comes to poisoning the stem cell environment. The stress hormone cortisol directly fuels the accumulation of those toxic retired cells. I realized that sitting alone in my study, quietly worrying about my health and my decline, was actually accelerating the exact biological collapse I was terrified of. I had to force myself to manage my mind. I started doing 15 minutes of deep, slow breathing every afternoon just to force my nervous system to stand down. Eleanor and I made a concerted effort to see our friends more, to engage with our community, not just because it was pleasant, but because I finally understood that social connection is a biological necessity for a healing environment. I did add a few very specific supplements, but only the ones where I could see clear, undeniable logic in the research. I asked my doctor to check my vitamin D levels, and like most people my age, they were abysmal. I learned that vitamin D deficiency directly impairs the immune stem cells, so I started supplementing to get my blood levels into the optimal range. If I didn't eat fish that week, I took a high-quality omega-3 supplement, and I started incorporating red onions, capers, and apples into my diet as often as possible, because they contain a compound called quercetin that has shown some ability in preclinical models to help clear out those toxic senescent cells. I want to be very clear with you about what happened next. When I started doing all of this, when I changed my movement, my eating window, my sleep, my stress, I did not feel any different after a week. I didn't feel a sudden surge of youthful vitality after 2 weeks. This is where most people my age quit. They expect a 40-year accumulation of biological waste to be cleared out in 10 days. But I knew the mechanisms. I knew that cleaning up a toxic neighborhood takes time. It was around the 2nd month that I noticed the profound, quiet changes. The deep ache in my shoulders, the one I thought was just permanent arthritis, faded into a dull background noise. By month 3, I was waking up before my alarm, feeling rested in a way I hadn't felt in a decade. My recovery time from working in the yard went from a week to a single day. The mental fog lifted. The relentless cycle of catching every cold stopped entirely. I am 77 years old today. I do not have the body of a 30-year-old, and I never will again. But I am not wearing a suit of wet lead anymore. I am active, I am present, I am strong enough to lift my grandchildren, and my mind is sharp enough to read the primary literature and understand exactly what is happening inside me. If you are in your 60s or 70s right now and you feel that rapid decline setting in, I need you to hear this. Your body is not out of parts. Your stem cells are not dead. They are trapped. They are sleeping. They are waiting for you to change the environment they live in. You have a window of time right now, before the structural damage becomes permanent, to send them a different signal. You don't need an expensive clinic. You need to walk. You need to compress your eating window. You need to sleep in the dark. You need to manage your stress. You need to stop accepting your decline as an inevitable destiny. The machinery of your youth is still inside you. It is just waiting for you to clear the floor so it can get back to work. I hope you decide to do it today, because that window does not stay open forever.